Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. The topic of this episode of the podcast will be student protests as a destabilizing mechanism against the capitalist world system. And what I mean by that will become clear over the course of this discussion. I was a part of one such student protest movement. I have discussed it many times. The American New Left. When I was in what was then called junior high school, now called, in most places anyway, middle school. Um, in my junior high school, called Wisdom Lane Junior High School, we had a chapter of the Students' Democratic Coalition. I drifted into it for some reason. I think it was because I was kind of looking for something. I literally had no friends as an autistic. And so I was trying to find some people that I could associate with. And these became people that I could. Uh, they literally became, I think, my first real friends. I never had friends before I was a member, I guess a member of the Students' Democratic Coalition. Um, we were committed to a variety of causes. Primarily, though, we focused on the Mexican migrant workers under Cesar Chavez and the way in which they were being exploited and are still being exploited by the California grape farmers. So, in other words, as I've said before, our protest, our petition campaign, while very well intentioned, did not work at all. It fell on its face. And I am very sorry about that. But that was really what happened to most of the New Left. And so the New Left ended with really no accomplishments to speak of. I mean, you can talk about some accomplishments in the sense of organizations like the Black Panthers that emerged from it. And there are still some groups which identify with Black Panther ideology. But in terms of the average person in the New Left, most of us walked away feeling defeated and discouraged. And that was basically the end of the left in the United States. And the left really has never truly recovered from that event. Um, there is no left in the United States anymore, per se. We may be seeing a burgeoning one right now with a new student protest movement, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But at least for now, that movement seems to be widely scattered, and whether it will be sustained is an open question. But my movement, the New Left, and the work that we did in support of the Mexican Migrant Workers Union and in support of the effort to ban anti-ballistic missiles and many other projects that we were involved in was the movement that I was involved in as a student, as a young student. And it is a memory which I will treasure for the rest of my life. It was an opportunity for me. It was my introduction to communism. I became a communist in 1968 through the Students' Democratic Coalition, and I have remained a communist until this day. Most people, as they get older, in my experience anyway, tend to become less and less radical. Um, that is not true with me. As I've gotten older, I have gotten more and more radical, more and more revolutionary. Why is that? Well, I can think of some possibilities, but I really don't know for sure. But for example, Senator Bernie Sanders, who has called himself a democratic socialist, is really misnaming himself. Now, was he a democratic socialist at one time? Yes. About 30 years ago. Is he one now? No, at least not as the term is generally used. Bernie Sanders is clearly a capitalist, clearly a capitalist. Now, he supports social democracy, which is basically progressivism, but social democracy, in effect, is the evolutionary socialism of Edward Bernstein. And that is a movement with which Rosa Luxemburg, who was one of my heroines, strongly opposed. For her entire career, she became an intellectual enemy to Edward Bernstein. And that is why I love her so much. She challenged Bernstein at every turn. That was really good of her to do that. And I will love her for the rest of my life as well. She was assassinated in 1919, the same year that my father was born, which makes her even more memorable to me. Well, getting back to the subject, there have been other student protest movements since the New Left right here in the US. The one I remember the best is one I was not personally involved with because of where I was living at the time. It was called the Occupy movement, originally Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street was started by a magazine called Adbusters, which still exists. If you Google Adbusters, you will find their website and you can read about them and about the way in which they came up with the idea for Occupy Wall Street. It was a very successful movement in a way, in the sense that it did what Adbusters wanted it to do. The concepts of the 99% and the 1% came from Occupy Wall Street. Eventually, Occupy Wall Street spawned other Occupy movements. Most recently, as I recall, an Occupy movement in Hong Kong, when many citizens of Hong Kong were objecting to what they regarded as an intrusion of mainland China into their affairs and a betrayal, as they saw it, of the promises made by mainland China not to take over or not to regulate Hong Kong until many years later. And so from the standpoint of that Occupy movement in Hong Kong, mainland China had broken its promises. And I must say that I tend to agree with them. And so I certainly stood by those students and others who were involved in that Occupy movement, although as far as I know, most of them were not communists. I wish they were. Maybe they were a few, but to the best of my knowledge, most of them were not. Now, we are in the midst, or maybe at the end, I hope not, of another student protest movement, really a global one, against Zionism, or at least against the extreme Zionism being led by Benjamin Netanyahu, when he has invaded Gaza because of a jailbreak, which is precisely what Hamas did. It committed a jailbreak. For a long time, Israel has insisted, for reasons I don't understand, that other people recognize Israel's right to exist. That's insecurity. That's real insecurity. I don't know why anyone in Israel would care. I mean, I don't remember the last time that any American said something like that. You need to recognize America's right to exist. It's only Israel. And why? Well, I think the reason is clear. It's because of all the war crimes they have committed. And they want to be able to defend themselves from it by saying, we have a right to exist. And therefore, what we did was not a war crime. It was simply ensuring our continued existence, I suppose. Well, that is a matter to be determined. But Israel is, in my opinion, the greatest state terrorist nation in the world. And it should be regarded as such by every clear-thinking socialist or communist. Honestly, I will not even step foot in Israel. I will not go there. And I've been invited several times to attend conferences, but I said no, because I will not support, even to a little degree, the economy of the state of Israel. And I say that as somebody born of two Ashkenazi Jewish parents. But I despise the state of Israel. And do I accept its quote unquote right to exist? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Why? Because Israel was started in 1948 by the United Nations. The problem was that it was started on indigenous land. It's not like nobody was living there. There was a civilization there. There were homes there. Israel has tried to rewrite history to make it seem like they arrived in a desert and they changed the desert into a glorious garden or civilization where there was no civilization before. That's total BS. Total BS. The civilization that existed in Gaza, in Israel, is now a prison camp. Why? Because Israel has taken that civilization and moved it from Palestine into the prison camp. So present-day Israel, which is really the remnants, in a sense, much of it, of the civilization that existed in Gaza, has been betrayed, totally betrayed by Israel. Over many decades, Israel has insisted on going to war against Gaza. Why? Because Gazans have had the audacity to send bombs into Israel. Well, that's called revolution, or at least some kind of embryonic revolution. Gaza has virtually no weapons. There is very little that Gaza can do without help from, say, Iran. So Gaza is using what it can to protest against Israel. And so some members of Hamas, which is the legitimate governing body of the Gazans, made that jailbreak into Israel. And that resulted in the war against Hamas, or really the war against Gaza. From every impression I've had, Israeli officials make no distinction between Gaza and Hamas. Why? Because if you are killing children, if you are bombing hospitals, if you are killing babies in incubators and calling that a war against Hamas, then you are either stupid or you simply don't care. And you are trying to destroy people by any means possible. And now that destruction is trying to move these Gazans from Asia into Egypt, which is in Africa. Talk about genocide. talk about genocide. That will be the ultimate result of this genocide, relocating the Gazans from Asia into Africa, and yet that is precisely what Israel would like to do. There is a truce proposal, but you know what? I do not trust Israel with any truce. I could care less about a truce. And I hope that Hamas does not buy into it. I hope they are not betrayed by Israel once again. I hope they have learned their lesson that they can never trust Israel, a state terrorist country, which should never have existed in the first place. So no, Israel has no right to exist. Palestine does, from the river to the sea. Israel is a colonial power, a Western power, a first world power, placed into Palestine by the United Nations. Now, as a guy from Jewish ancestry, I certainly have immense compassion and empathy for those who died in the Holocaust, whether Jews or others. My family was not among them. My family, both sides of it, had emigrated from Germany and Russia and Austria a couple of generations earlier. So we were not involved at all in the Holocaust. Now, is it possible that we may have some distant cousins who were killed in the Holocaust? I would say that is likely, but nobody that we know, nobody that our family has ever had any contact with. And so I can have empathy for the people who went through the Holocaust, although I have no experience, or nobody in my immediate family or even extended family has had any experience with the Holocaust. I am grateful for that and very sympathetic for those families, again, whether Jewish, Gypsy, Jehovah's Witness, Roman Catholic, whatever, who were killed in that horrendous action taken by the Third Reich. I am a compassionate person, but that compassion extends to the Palestinians. And so the Israelis, the Jewish Israelis, many of whom are descendants of the Germans who lived in Nazi Germany, who survived the Holocaust. Not all of them. Some of them come from Russia and other places which were never a part of the Holocaust at all, were never victimized by the Holocaust. I have some friends, or former friends really, who are American citizens and who now basically live, I guess the best way to put it is commute between the US and Israel. Kind of an odd situation, but I've already talked about that a bit in the past. I really wish that Israel would simply go away. I wish no harm on the Israelis. I would imagine that many of them would wish harm on me if they somehow see this podcast, because a lot of Jews, when they see someone of Jewish ancestry making the statement, have all sorts of horrendous names to call them. And I would expect that I would be called by those names as well. Do I care? Of course I don't care. They can't hurt me. I mean, what are they going to do? They can't take away my job because I'm retired. So I can't lose my job because of them. And even when I was working, I was a tenured professor. So again, I had freedom of speech, also called academic freedom. I could say what I wanted. And when I was a professor, I would very commonly speak out against Israel. So, in other words, the situation in the US right now with the student protesters against the Israeli government is to me a very hopeful sign, or at least possibly a hopeful sign. Why? Because student protests can have a destabilizing effect. I saw that back in the 1960s and early 1970s. Although we were not successful, we certainly did some good. We did some good. For example, we raised the consciousness of Americans about the injustice of the Indochina War. And many people who had been proud supporters of that war, like my parents, for example, turned against it. Many other people that I know who had been proud supporters of that war also turned against it. And I think that the New Left was one of the major factors which led to that change of heart among many Americans. And ultimately, I think that is what convinced Richard Nixon to pull out of Vietnam and the rest of Indochina. He really had no choice. It's not like he had the ability to decide, do I stay in or do I leave? He had to leave, despite the protestations of his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who came into the Oval Office crying and begging Richard Nixon not to leave Indochina. And the biggest defeat for Kissinger and those who supported that war is that now the US and Vietnam are on friendly terms, are trading partners. So that whole war has now been shown to be a complete waste of time, to have killed people totally without any necessity. People died, countless people died, whether Americans, Vietnamese, Cambodians, etc., died for literally no reason. So, right now, the student protest movement against these horrendous actions being taken by Israel against Gaza may, I hope, lead to a second destabilization. Maybe there have been more too, but those are the ones I recall. I don't think Occupy really destabilized much because the FBI was very quick to shut it down in the US. They learned from what we did in the New Left. They did not want to see that mistake repeated again, and they were successful. And so there is no Occupy movement in the US anymore. But it is possible. Now, have the FBI and other law enforcement agencies been trying to shut down the protests against Israel? Oh, yeah. Many people in the media have, I think, the wrong reason in mind when they think, gee, why would the FBI, why would the US government care about student protesters against another country? Another country? To me, that misses the point entirely. It has nothing to do with the fact that Israel is another country. It doesn't really have much to do even with Zionism. What the FBI and other law enforcement agencies are trying to do, in my opinion, is to prevent a second New Left. Because if you go back and look at what we did, even though by and large we were not that successful, we were successful in some areas, like, as I said, the Indochina War. Students, the voices of students can be very, very powerful, as we have seen over the last several weeks, with students, despite being arrested, being willing to stay on those campuses and remain there and protest against Israel's occupation and war in Gaza. So that, I think, is the genuine reason for why the US and law enforcement agencies in the US care that much about student protests against Israel. That, I think, is the reason. You may not agree, but to me, that is the only conclusion that makes sense. The US does not want to see itself destabilized. What that should do, for me as a communist and socialist, and perhaps for you, if you are a communist or socialist as well, is to make us more enthusiastic about student protests. Because student protests, while not revolutionary per se necessarily, I don't think that revolution will start in the US. At the very least, student protests can destabilize the capitalist world system. They did with the Vietnam or Indochina War. They began to with the Occupy movement, and probably would have, I think, had the FBI not shut it down. And it could potentially, with the situation with the student protests against Israel. So why is, for example, Israel so willing all of a sudden to have a truce with Hamas? First, again, as I said, I don't trust Israel because I think they can change their mind on a dime. But I think their willingness is because of their recognition of the power of student protests and their ability to result in global instability. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.